We are now in question 72 of Prima Secunda of the Summa Theologia, and we are talking about the distinction of sins. This is a very practical 9 articles in this question because not all sins are the same. How do they differ from one another? How do they differ as far as seriousness and species and object and circumstances? And these kind of questions are what are on the mind of St. Thomas Aquinas as he goes about in these particular questions. Let me make my picture a little bit bigger there, which I think will make it a little bit easier to see. So this is the first article, whether sins differ in species according to their objects. Now, he's going to say yes, the object is very important here, but what exactly is the object of a sin? Okay, well, I'll read the answer and then we'll talk about that a little bit. He says 2 things concur in the nature of sin, the voluntary act and its inordinateness, okay? How inordinate is the actual act, which consists in departing from God's law. Of these 2, one is referred essentially to the sinner who intends such and such an act in such a matter, okay? While the other, the inordinateness of the act, is referred accidentally to the intention of the sinner, for no one acts intending evil, according to Dionysius. Okay, that's very important. Nobody acts intending evil, which you might think, well, of course they do. Sometimes people do things that are evil. Well, St. Thomas Aquinas, being a very optimistic philosopher and theologian, follows Aristotle in saying we only really act for something that's perceived to be good. You know, there's something good in it, otherwise we wouldn't do it, right? So that's what Dionysius is getting at here. Now, it is evident that a thing derives its species from that which is essential and not from that which is accidental, because what is accidental is outside the specific nature. Consequently, sins differ specifically on the part of the voluntary acts rather than on the inordinateness inherent to sin. Now, voluntary acts differ in species according to their objects, and he refers back to question 18 of Prima Secunda, where he went through that. Therefore, it follows that sins are properly distinguished in species by their objects. So what's an object of a sin? Well, the examples I could think of is, if you steal, $10 versus stealing $1,000. Well, the object of the second one is bigger. Or you, hit your brother or hit your mom. Well, the mom is greater than the brother, and so those might be circumstances, but it's also the objects. Okay, the objective also. I think you got to think of why did you do it? What is the reason? So those are the things that I think he's getting at here. Article 2, whether spiritual sins are fittingly distinguished from carnal sins. Okay, a carnal sin would be something like lust or gluttony or eating too much or sleeping too much or sexual sins, right? So he is are they different? Well, we know they are. Sins take their species from their objects, as we just learned. Now, every sin consists in the desire for some mutable good for which man has an inordinate desire, and the possession of which gives him inordinate pleasure. Pleasure is twofold, one belonging to the soul and is consummated in a mere apprehension of a thing possessed in accordance with desire. This can be called spiritual pleasure. For example, and Thomas always likes to give examples, when one takes pleasure in human praise or the like, right? The other pleasure is bodily and is realized in bodily touch, and this can be called the carnal pleasure. Accordingly, those sins which consist in spiritual pleasure are called spiritual sins, and those which consist in carnal pleasure are called carnal sins, such as gluttony and sexual pleasures. Okay, as I talked about a moment ago. So yeah, there is that distinction between those sins. Article 3, whether sins differ specifically in reference to their causes. What causes a sin, and is that going to have a specific, a difference in the species of the sin itself? And interestingly, he goes back to Aristotle's 4 causes. Okay, so the formal, the final, the efficient, and the material cause, right? And he says there are 4 kinds of causes, and they're attributed to various things in various ways. because the formal and the material cause regard properly the substance of a thing, and consequently substances differ in respect of their matter and form, both in species and in genus. So remember, Aristotle said that when a form and a matter come together, it creates a substance, right? So that's going to be kind of carried over here with sins as well. Formal cause and material cause are what gives the substance of the sin. But then he goes down and he says, thus, he gives an example here. He says, from fear engendering false humility, a man may proceed to theft or murder or to neglect of the flock committed to his care. And these same things may proceed from love enkindling to undue ardor. Hence it is evident that sins do not differ specifically according to their various active and motive causes, but only in respect of diversity in the final cause, which is the end and the object of the will. Human acts take their species from the end. Okay, what was the final cause is the purpose or the reason you do something. Okay, so he's saying not material so much, not formal and not efficient, but really the final cause. What's the reason that you did something? Okay, I think that's what he's getting at here. Article 4, whether sin is fittingly divided into sin against God, sin against oneself, and sin against neighbor. 3 different kinds of sin. He says sin is an inordinate act. Now, there should be a threefold order in man. One in relation to the rule of reason, insofar as our actions and passions should be commensurate with the rule of reason. Another order is in relation to the divine law, whereby man should be directed to all things, in all things, and if man were by nature a solitary animal, this twofold order would suffice. But since man is naturally a civic and social animal, as shown by Aristotle, hence a third order is necessary, whereby man is directed in relation to other men among whom he has to dwell. Okay, so we have things that we have to conform to reason, which is something that is given to us. We are rational creatures, so we have to our actions have to be reasonable. But then higher than that, there's the divine law, the divine reason, which is our reason is subordinate to that. And then he says, well, we also have to deal with other people. And so there's 3 things that are being discussed here. For whatever things are comprised under the order of reason are comprised under the order of God himself, yet some things are comprised under the order of God which surpass the human reason, such as matters of faith and things due to God alone. Hence he that sins in such matters, for instance, heresy, sacrilege, blasphemy, is said to sin against God. So some sins are directly against God. Okay, so that's the first category. In like manner, the first order includes the third and surpasses it, because in all things wherein we are directed in reference to our neighbor, we need to be directed according to the order of reason. Okay, so that's kind of self-explanatory. Yet in some things we are directed according to reason in relation to ourselves only, and not in reference to our neighbor. And when man sins in these matters, he is said to sin against himself, as is seen in the gluttony, lust, and the prodigal. Okay, a prodigal like the prodigal son, right? But when man sins in matters concerning his neighbor, he is said to sin against his neighbor, as appears as the thief to the thief and the murderer. Wherefore, these distinctions of sin is in respect of their objects, according to which the species of sins are diversified, and consequently this distinction of sins is properly one of different species of sins, because the virtues also... Okay, then what he's saying is, as we mentioned a moment ago, the object of the sin. Okay, if you're sinning against God, or you're sinning against a neighbor, or you're sinning against yourself, those are the objects of the sin. But then he says, well, it's the same thing. We divide the virtues accordingly. We have theological virtues, what have to do with God. We have virtues that have to do with ourselves, like temperance and fortitude. And then we also have justice, which has to do with our relationship with other people. All right, so of course the virtues are going to be lined up against the sins and the impulses that we have to be inordinate. Article 5, whether the division of sins are according to their debt of punishment, and does the debt of punishment diversify the species? Okay, in things that differ specifically, we find a twofold difference. The first causes the diversity of species and is not found to save in different species, as in rational and irrational, animate, inanimate. The other difference is consequent to specific diversity, and though in some cases it may be consequent to specific diversity, yet in others it may be found within the same species. He gives an example. He says white and black are consequent to the specific diversity of crow and swan. So he's saying if you see a white crow and a black crow, or a white swan and a black swan, they're different species. Now, I don't know if that's true across the board, but that's what he's saying here. But then he says, well, with man, you see a black man and a white man, they're the same species. It's just the color of the skin is accidental and not specific. All right, so then he goes on. He says, we must therefore say that the difference between venial and mortal sin, or any other difference in respect of the debt of punishment, cannot be a difference constituting specific diversity. So what he's going to say here is that whether it's venial or mortal is just a matter of degree, and it's not going to change the very species of the sin. For what is accidental never constitutes a species, and what is outside the agent's intention is accidental. Now it is evident that punishment is outside the intention of the sinner, wherefore it is accidental, referred to sin on the part of the sinner. Then he goes on to say, now the difference between venial and mortal sin is consequent to the diversity of that inordinateness which constitutes the notion of sin. For inordinateness is twofold, one that destroys the principle of order, and another which, without destroying the principle of order, implies the inordinateness in things which follow the principle. The principle of the entire moral order is the last end, which stands in the same relation to matters of action, as the indemonstrable principle does to matters of speculation. Therefore, when the soul is so disordered by sin as to turn from its last end, that is God, to whom it is united in charity, there is mortal sin. But when it's disordered without turning away from God, there's venial sin. Okay, so there are degrees, but that may not necessarily change the species, but it does change the punishment. And I think that is what Thomas is getting at here. Article 6, whether sins of commission and omission differ specifically. So a sin of omission and a sin of commission, are they in a whole different species? There's a twofold difference in sins, a material difference and a formal difference. The material difference is to be observed in the natural species of the sinful act, while the formal difference is gathered from their relation to one proper end, which is their proper object. Then he gives an example. Strangling, stoning, and stabbing come under one species of murder, although the actions themselves differ specifically according to their natural species. Okay, the very different ways of murdering people, but they're all specifically the same thing. It's murder, regardless of how you did it. Accordingly, if we refer to the material species in sin of omission and commission, they differ specifically, using species in a broad sense insofar as negation and privation may have a species. But if we refer to the formal species of sins of omission and commission, they do not differ specifically because they are directed to the same end and proceed from the same motive. For the covetous man, in order to hoard money, robs and omits to give what he ought, and in like manner the glutton, to satiate his appetite, both eats too much and omits prescribed fasts. And so really you commit and omit for similar reasons. Okay, so he's saying specifically they're going to be the same. Article 7, whether sins are fatally divided into sins of thought, word, and deed. And he says things differ specifically in two ways. First, when each has the complete species, and what he's going to get at here is a deed is a complete species, whereas a thought is the beginning of it. Okay, you think it, and then you might speak it, and then you do it. And so it's a matter of degrees is what he is going to get at, kind of rising through the degrees of sin. Article 8, whether excess and deficiency diversify the species of a sin. Okay, how, you can remember virtue is in the mean. And you're going to have two vices on either side of the mean. One is excess and one is deficiency. He said there are two things in sin, the act itself and the inordinateness insofar as sin is a departure from the order of reason and the divine law. The species of sin is gathered not from its inordinateness, which is outside the sinner's intention. Okay, that's what he talked about in the first article. But one the contrary from the act of its terminating in the object to which the sinner's intention is directed. Consequently, wherever we find a different motive inclining the intention to sin, there will be a different species of sin. Now it is evident that the motive for sinning in sins of excess is not the same as the motive for sinning in sins of deficiency. In fact, they are contrary to one another, just as the motive in the sin of intemperance is love for bodily pleasures, while the motive for the sin of insensibility is hatred of the same. So he's saying that, let's say you should have a certain work ethic, and you might be really lazy or overly working. Well, those are very different sins. Okay, they're opposite each other, in fact, and the virtue is in the middle. All right, finally, article number 9, whether sins differ specifically in respect of different circumstances. And basically in this one, he's going to say sometimes yes and sometimes no. Sometimes the circumstances are going to be such that they don't change the species of the sin, and sometimes they will. The example he gives here at the end, he says, if a man eats hastily, it may be due to the fact that he cannot brook the delay in taking food on account of a rapid exhaustion of the digestive humors, and that he desires too much food may be due to a naturally strong digestion. That he desires choice meats is due to his desire for pleasure in taking food. Okay, hence in such matters, the corruption of different circumstances entails different species of sin. So those are two very, very different reasons why somebody might eat too hastily, all right? And so those do change the species, but in some cases, it doesn't, all right? So that is question number 72 of Prima Secunda, the distinction of sins. Thank you for joining me. And we will continue on this treatise of evil habits all the way through Article 89. So we still have a ways to go. Thanks for joining me. God bless you.